Vladimir Putin on Wednesday ordered a partial military mobilization for his war in Ukraine, prompting panic and packed flights out of Russia as Kremlin's invasion has been met with humiliating losses in recent days amid a stunning counteroffensive by Ukrainian soldiers. So does the public backlash in Russia look to change the course of Putin's war in Ukraine? What are the chances of a nuclear confrontation between Russia and the West? And what can be done to stop the sufferings of Ukrainians amid Russia's invasion? Welcome to Friday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Come tomorrow, that would be Saturday, we mark precisely 7 months since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In recent days, there has been a turning of the tide in tangible favor of Ukraine, and Russia's Vladimir Putin, in response, is resorting to desperate measures. For more, I have Professor Kim Young-jun at the Korea National Defense University. Professor Kim, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much.
I also have Dr. Malcolm Davis at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute live on the line as well. Dr. Davis, it's good to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Professor Kim, let's begin with some of the more recent developments regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Putin has called for a partial military mobilization, which appears to have prompted much public backlash within Russia. Do you see this as perhaps changing the course of Putin's war in Ukraine?
Over the day, the Russian public has many demonstrations against this mobilization. And some Russian young men already flee to the foreign country in avoiding this mobilization. Absolutely some reaction. But at the same time, for the long term, it is not clear how the Russian public actually reaction to this mobilization and how this war will continue and how long. So we need to more time to check these kinds of the Russian public reaction and Putin's leadership, how to handle this kind of backlash for mobilization.
Right, and staying with Mr. Putin, Dr. Davis, he's also resorted, that is, to playing victim, claiming that the West is threatening Russia with nuclear weapons and that he too would respond in kind to protect his people and his country. First of all, why the lie? And Lord forbid, do you believe Mr. Putin will put his reckless threat to practice?
Look, I think Putin is facing basically the end of his presidency as Russia goes down in defeat to Ukraine. He's backed into a corner, so he's lashing out and he's making nuclear threats to try and intimidate the West to get them to back down in their support for Ukraine in terms of military support. I think that the actual risk of him using nuclear weapons is not high right at the moment. But as we get into the northern spring, when the Ukrainians begin their offensives after the winter, that risk goes up, particularly if it becomes clear that the mass mobilization has failed to achieve any path to victory for the Russians.
Right, I see. And Professor Kim, in the early days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was fear about whether Ukraine would be able to hold its own in the face of an attack by a major world military power. Do you care to elaborate by sharing with us perhaps details about the two countries' military size, equipment, and so forth?
Actually, it's not clear about details of the two countries' actual military capability and equipment because we don't have the original sources. Most of the details is sources are open sources based on media or other combination of sources. So we already know Russia is one of the most military power and have been under the Russian defense reform for a while. But on the other hand, we don't know much about the Ukraine military power, and we just know about the U.S. support, some equipment for the Ukraine. But the war is not just about the quantitative data or how much they have of military equipment. It is more like the combination of will of the people and the strategy and also way of war and others. So it is too early to clarify a direction of war and who will win this war.
Right, of course. But in the meantime, though, starting in September, Dr. Davis, Ukraine has been staging a stunning counteroffensive, if I may say so myself, in the northeast and south that have resulted in the regaining of Ukrainian territory previously seized by Russia. How do you explain and perhaps assess Ukraine's advances?
Look, I think it goes down to the professionalism of the Ukrainian forces, their superior use of modern military technology, their superior use of combined arms operations and effective logistics. Conversely, if you look at the Russians, they have poor morale, their logistics are shoddy, their ability to use combined arms warfare is very low. Everything that we thought the Russians were effective at, they're not. And so I think that we have been surprised by how poor the Russians have shown themselves to be. And I think that the fact that the Russians invaded Ukrainian territory and conducted brutal atrocities against Ukrainian people only reinforced the resolve of the Ukrainians to fight the Russians and take back every inch of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, I would say.
Right. And Professor Kim, in the meantime, against that backdrop that would be, Russian-held regions that would be, are planning to hold on this Friday, starting this Friday that would be, referendums on joining Russia. What does this move by Kremlin imply, do you think?
This is a very similar process of the Crimea annexation in 2014, and Putin tried the same process. In this region, people oriented on Russia definitely will vote for Russia, but it does not fit for the Russia-Ukraine constitution at all. So it will be a very controversial issue. But anyway, Russia seems to have a legitimacy from this vote and want to end this war by then.
Dr. Davis, I understand Australia and Ukraine, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly over in New York, are working to send more military equipment to ground forces in Ukraine. Could you tell us a bit more about this effort?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think what you'll see is the Americans and the Australians together with their allies in Europe, including Britain, working together to try and continue to flow weapons, systems and advanced military capabilities to the Ukrainians. HIMARS is a classic example of a weapon system that has had a game-changing effect on the war. It has enabled the Ukrainians to do these offensives by exploiting long-range firepower. Well, the key challenge now, the key question now for the West is, do we provide even longer-range weapons that can enable the Ukrainians to make faster progress in future offensives? Also, I think you're likely to see a discussion about more sophisticated main battle tanks and armored fighting vehicles going to the Ukrainians, and of course air power. So the Australians and the Americans and others are all working together to ensure that that flow of weapons continues to Ukraine, so that they are then well positioned probably in 2023 sometime to bring this war to a close and decisively defeat the Russians. As I said earlier, the key issue then is, how does Putin respond if he's backed into a corner? Does he reach for tactical nuclear weapons at that point, or is he removed from power before he has the chance to do that?
Right, a very big question there. Professor Kim, in the meantime, though, what can you tell us about South Korea's support to Ukraine?
Yeah, it is somewhat complicated. Actually, as everybody knows, Ukraine president desperately asked for military support of the ROK army. But we have some complication process, and the people of the ROK already support the food and water and others for living of Ukrainian people as a humanitarian support, and it will be continued and should be continued. However, military support, it seems like it will be not an option for the ROK, because we have a much more complicated situation in the Northeast Asia regarding Russia and others. So military option will be not an option to the Republic of Korea government.
Right, I see. Dr. Davis, what are your prospects with regard to this ongoing Russian assault against Ukraine? I mean, is there no way perhaps to end this war then?
Look, there's this very simple way to end the war, and that's for Russia to give up. To withdraw its forces from Ukrainian territory, to give back territories captured, including Crimea, and accept Ukrainian conditions. But of course, the Russians aren't about to do that. So there's no peaceful way, there's no negotiated way to end this conflict. I think what will require is for the Ukrainians to decisively defeat the Russians in battle. And they're well on the way to achieving that They've certainly made huge progress around Kharkiv. They're making progress around Kherson. I think that in 2023, you will see further advances, and providing we can avoid that spectre of escalation through the use of tactical nuclear weapons, the Russians should be defeated, Putin removed from power, and hopefully then we have some way of resetting the relationship between Russia and the West so that this never happens again.
Right, of course not. Professor Kim, on a more poignant note, Ukraine is reportedly including South Korea's post-war economic reconstruction campaign, better known as the Miracle on the Han River, in its high school textbooks. If military assistance, as you mentioned earlier, is not an option for South Korea, would South Korea perhaps be able to play a more active role then in helping Ukraine to rebuild its infrastructure once peace is established?
Yeah, we have a lot of options to support Ukraine. Actually, we are one of the economic power in supporting, able to support Ukraine. And also it is great to the ROC as well to be an active player in rebuilding infrastructure of the Ukraine and peacemaking process after the end of Ukraine war. So the ROC has a similar experience from the Korean War to the economic miracle we call Han River miracle, and the ROC will be a similar the experience. So we can be a good partner and good advisor for the Ukraine government and people. And this is a great to show also the ROC as an international player in a good way.
Right, and meanwhile, back on the war front, Dr. Davis, China and India have expressed their reservations regarding Russia's war in Ukraine. Do you see these sentiments perhaps as affecting the future course of Kremlin's military campaign?
Look, it became painfully obvious at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting that Putin was very much the junior partner to China in the so-called no limits partnership that was established by Beijing and Moscow back in March. I think that what you are seeing is the dropping off of international support for Russia, particularly from India. Beijing is being a little bit more circumspect. It's still possible that China could swing around and come to the assistance of Russia by providing military material. But they know that if they do that, they'll suffer economic sanctions in the process. It's a question of whether Xi Jinping feels that it's more important to keep Putin in power and avoid the risk of nuclear war, as opposed to essentially cutting him loose and abandoning him. And it's still uncertain as to what Beijing will do. But I do think you are seeing other states distancing themselves from Russia as a result of Russia's actions in Ukraine.
And Dr. Davis, going back to a point that you mentioned earlier, should Russia's Putin decide to resort to the use of nuclear weapons, do we have any options to take up in response, the West, that is?
Well, the current thinking is that if he uses a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, the West, i.e. the US and NATO, would use conventional military force against Russian forces to try and prevent further nuclear use. But the risk, of course, is that in doing so, the Russians would then retaliate with additional nuclear weapons use, and we'd be locked into a very dangerous escalatory cycle that could end up horribly in a full-scale nuclear war. We want to avoid that. So we're trying to deter that initial nuclear use by Russia. And from what I understand, the Americans have been sending all sorts of back-channel signals to Moscow saying, look, don't do it, because there'll be huge consequences if you do. You will not come out as the victor.
Right, and hopefully they will listen then. All right, Dr. Davis, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. And Professor Kim, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.